Olivia never thought a simple weekend getaway would turn into the most terrifying experience of her life. As a junior at West Virginia University studying environmental science, she had always loved the mountains and felt completely at home in the wilderness. When her 3 roommates suggested they spend their spring break at her family's remote cabin in the Monongahela National Forest, it seemed like the perfect escape from midterm stress and campus drama. The cabin had been in Olivia's family for 3 generations, built by her great-grandfather in the 1940s as a hunting retreat. Nestled deep in a hollow about 40 miles southeast of Morgantown, the property was accessible only by a winding dirt road that snaked through dense forest for nearly 6 miles before reaching the clearing where the modest log structure sat. Her father had always warned her about going up there alone, not because of any specific danger, but simply because of how isolated it was. The nearest neighbor was over 10 miles away, and cell phone service was completely non-existent. Olivia and her friends arrived on a Friday afternoon in late March. The spring weather had been unpredictable, with temperatures swinging from the 70s during the day to near freezing at night. Sarah, her psychology major roommate, had packed enough snacks and supplies for a small army. Jessica, who was studying journalism, brought her camera equipment, hoping to document their mountain adventure for her portfolio, and Emma, the pre-med student who rarely took breaks from studying, had reluctantly agreed to join them, only after Olivia promised there would be no hiking involved and plenty of time to just relax by the fire. The first night passed without incident. They built a fire in the stone fireplace, played card games, and caught up on gossip from campus. The cabin felt cozy and safe, exactly as Olivia remembered it from childhood visits. The thick log walls seemed to hold the warmth inside while keeping the cold mountain air at bay. They had brought battery-powered lanterns since the cabin had no electricity, and the flickering light created dancing shadows on the walls that reminded Olivia of her grandfather's old stories about the early settlers who had carved out lives in these unforgiving mountains. On Saturday morning, Jessica noticed something odd while she was taking photographs of the sunrise from the front porch. She called Olivia over to look at a small pile of objects that had been placed on the porch railing overnight. The arrangement consisted of 3 smooth river stones, a handful of dried berries, and what appeared to be a small bird skull, all carefully positioned in a perfect triangle. None of them remembered seeing it the night before, and they had been the last ones on the porch before going to bed. Sarah suggested that maybe some animal had dropped the items there, but Jessica pointed out that the arrangement was too deliberate, too purposeful, to be random. Emma, ever the skeptic, theorized that maybe another camper or hiker had left them as some kind of trail marker or gift. Olivia felt uneasy but tried not to let it show. Her grandfather had always told stories about the old mountain traditions, how the original inhabitants would leave offerings for safe passage or good hunting, but those were just stories, remnants of folklore from a bygone era. They decided to explore the area around the cabin that day, following the old logging trails that crisscrossed the mountainside. Olivia led them to her favorite spot, a small waterfall about half a mile through the woods, where her father had taught her to fish as a child. The hike was easy, following a well-worn path that had been used by hunters and her family for decades. They spent the afternoon by the water, taking photographs and enjoying the peaceful sound of the cascade tumbling over moss-covered rocks. It was on the way back to the cabin that Emma noticed they were being watched. She had fallen behind the group slightly, stopping to examine some wildflowers that were just beginning to bloom, when she caught a glimpse of movement in her peripheral vision. About 50 yards away, partially hidden behind a massive oak tree, stood a figure. At first glance, she thought it might be another hiker, but something about the way the person was standing, perfectly motionless and partially concealed, made her heart race. Emma called out to her friends, but by the time they turned around to look, the figure had vanished. She tried to describe what she had seen, but the details were frustratingly vague. The person had been wearing dark clothing, possibly a woman based on the build and height, with long dark hair that appeared unkempt and matted. What disturbed Emma most was that the figure had not moved like a normal person. There had been something almost animal-like about the posture, the way the head had been tilted while watching them. That evening, the atmosphere in the cabin felt different. The easy camaraderie of the previous night had been replaced by a subtle tension that none of them wanted to acknowledge directly. They made dinner and tried to maintain normal conversation, but everyone kept glancing toward the windows, even though the curtains were drawn. Olivia found herself listening for sounds outside, straining to hear anything beyond the normal creaking of the old cabin and the whisper of wind through the pine trees. Around 10 o'clock, they heard the first deliberate sound. It was a rhythmic tapping on the exterior wall of the cabin, starting near the front door and slowly moving along the wall toward the kitchen window. The sound was methodical and purposeful, clearly made by human hands rather than a branch or animal. They all froze, listening as the tapping continued around the entire perimeter of the cabin before stopping at the back door. Jessica grabbed one of the battery-powered lanterns and approached the back window, trying to peer through a gap in the curtains. She could see nothing in the darkness beyond the small circle of light cast by their lantern, but she had the unmistakable sensation of being observed. The tapping resumed, this time directly on the window glass, just inches from her face. She jerked backward with a muffled scream, nearly dropping the lantern. They huddled together in the center of the main room, debating whether they should try to leave immediately or wait until morning. Olivia's car was parked about 30 yards from the cabin, but the idea of venturing outside in the darkness felt impossibly dangerous. They decided to wait it out, taking turns staying awake to listen for any signs of intrusion while the others tried to sleep. Around 3 in the morning, during Sarah's watch, she heard footsteps on the front porch. Unlike the previous tapping, these sounds were clearly human footsteps, but they moved with an odd, shuffling gait. The footsteps circled the porch several times before stopping directly in front of the main door. Then came a new sound that made Sarah's blood run cold: the slow, deliberate turning of the door handle. The door was locked, but the handle continued to turn back and forth with increasing force. Sarah woke the others as quietly as possible, and they all listened in terror as something began pushing against the door, testing its strength. The assault on the door continued for nearly 20 minutes before stopping abruptly. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the sounds had been. When morning finally came, they discovered that their overnight visitor had left another gift. This time, it was placed directly in front of the door where they could not miss it. The arrangement was larger and more elaborate than the previous offering: a circle of animal bones surrounding a pile of fresh wildflowers, with several crude drawings scratched into the dirt around the perimeter. The drawings appeared to depict human figures, but they were distorted and primitive, like something a child might create. More disturbing than the offering itself was the realization that whoever had left it had been standing directly outside their door for an extended period during the night. The drawings were intricate and would have taken considerable time to complete. Their visitor had been patient, methodical, and completely unafraid of being discovered. They packed their belongings as quickly as possible and prepared to leave, but their ordeal was not over. As they loaded the car, Emma spotted movement in the tree line about 100 yards away. The same figure from the previous day was watching them, but this time she was not hiding. The woman stood completely in the open, her long dark hair hanging in matted tangles around her shoulders, wearing what appeared to be layers of tattered clothing held together with strips of bark and vine. What made the sight truly horrifying was not just the woman's wild appearance, but her behavior. She was perfectly still, like a predator watching prey, and even from a distance they could see that her attention was focused entirely on them with an intensity that felt almost physical. She made no attempt to approach or communicate, but her presence conveyed a clear message. This was her territory, and they were not welcome. As they drove away from the cabin, following the winding dirt road back toward civilization. Olivia caught glimpses of the woman in her rearview mirror. She was following them, moving through the forest parallel to the road with an ease and speed that suggested intimate knowledge of every tree, rock, and hidden path. The woman kept pace with their vehicle for nearly 2 miles, before finally disappearing into the dense undergrowth. They drove in silence for most of the journey back to campus, each lost in their own thoughts about what they had experienced. It was only later, after they had returned to the safety and normalcy of their dormitory, that they began to piece together the full implications of their encounter. The woman had not been a random hiker or camper. Her behavior, her appearance, and her obvious familiarity with the terrain suggested someone who had been living in the wilderness for an extended period, possibly years. Olivia never returned to the family cabin, and she never told her parents about what had happened that weekend. She completed her environmental science degree and moved to a city on the East Coast, far from the mountains of West Virginia. But she never forgot the feeling of being watched by something that had once been human but had transformed into something else entirely. Sometimes, late at night, she still found herself wondering if the woman was still out there in those dark mountains, leaving her strange offerings and watching for the next group of unsuspecting visitors to venture into her domain. Adeline had been hiking the Appalachian Trail for over 15 years, covering thousands of miles across multiple states, and she prided herself on never getting lost. As an experienced solo hiker and certified wilderness guide from Asheville, North Carolina, she knew these mountains better than most people knew their own neighborhoods. She carried the best GPS equipment, maintained detailed trail maps, and always informed the ranger stations of her planned routes and expected return times. What happened to her on that foggy October morning challenged everything she thought she knew about the North Carolina wilderness. She had started her day hike at the craggy Pinnacle trailhead just before sunrise, planning to cover a moderate 12-mile section that would take her through some of the most spectacular fall foliage in the Blue Ridge Mountains. The weather forecast had called for clear skies and mild temperatures, perfect conditions for photographing the autumn colors that drew thousands of visitors to the region every year. Adeline preferred hiking during the week when the trails were less crowded, allowing her to experience the mountains in relative solitude. The first few miles proceeded exactly as planned. The trail was well marked and familiar, winding through stands of oak, maple, and hickory trees that blazed with orange, red, and gold. Adeline made good time, stopping occasionally to photograph particularly striking vistas or interesting rock formations. She had covered nearly 8 miles when the weather began to change dramatically and without warning. The fog rolled in like a living thing, rising from the valleys below and swallowing the mountainsides with supernatural speed. Within minutes, visibility dropped from several miles to less than 20 feet. The dense gray mist transformed the familiar landscape into an alien world where every tree looked identical and compass directions became meaningless. Adeline had experienced mountain fog before, but nothing like this sudden, impenetrable wall of moisture that seemed to muffle sound and distort spatial relationships. She stopped immediately and pulled out her GPS unit, but the thick canopy and heavy fog were interfering with satellite reception. The device showed her approximate location, but could not establish a reliable connection to guide her back to the main trail. Adeline decided to wait for the fog to lift, knowing that mountain weather could change as quickly as it had arrived. She found what appeared to be a sturdy tree to lean against and settled in to wait for better visibility. After sitting motionless for nearly 30 minutes, she began to hear sounds that did not belong in the natural environment. At first, she thought she was hearing other hikers moving through the fog, but the sounds were wrong somehow. Instead of the steady, measured pace of people following a trail, these were erratic movements, accompanied by what sounded like low, guttural communication between multiple individuals. The sounds would move closer, then fade away, then returned from a completely different direction. Adeline remained perfectly still, listening intently and trying to determine how many people might be nearby. The fog played tricks with sound, making it impossible to judge distance or direction accurately, but she gradually became convinced that she was listening to at least 3 or 4 individuals who were moving through the forest with remarkable stealth and coordination. What disturbed her most was that they did not sound like they were following any established trail or calling out to locate missing companions. When the fog finally began to thin after nearly 2 hours, Adeline discovered that she was completely disoriented. None of the landmarks around her looked familiar, and she could see no trace of the marked trail she'd been following. She was standing in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, but she could not determine which direction she had come from, or which way she should go to return to the main trail. Her GPS unit was still struggling with reception, showing only her general location within a several-mile radius. As visibility improved, she began to notice signs that other people had been in this area recently. There were broken branches at human height, disturbed ground cover, and what appeared to be crude shelters constructed from fallen logs and branches. The shelters were primitive, but showed clear evidence of regular use, with worn paths connecting them and fire pits containing recent ashes. Most disturbing were the bones scattered around the largest shelter, clearly from various animals, but arranged in patterns that suggested deliberate placement rather than natural scattering. Adeline decided to follow what appeared to be the most well-used path, hoping it would eventually lead to a recognizable trail or landmark. The path wound through increasingly dense forest, following natural contours of the mountainside, but clearly maintained by regular foot traffic. As she walked, she noticed more evidence of prolonged human habitation, additional shelters, food storage areas constructed from rocks and branches, and crude tools fashioned from stones and wooden handles. The realization that she had stumbled upon some kind of permanent settlement hit her when she discovered the cave system. Hidden behind a curtain of overgrown rhododendron bushes, the cave entrance was barely visible from the path, but the ground around it showed clear signs of constant use. Animal hides hung from wooden frames near the entrance, and the smell of wood smoke drifted from somewhere deep within the cave system. This was not a temporary campsite or emergency shelter, but a long-term dwelling that had been occupied for months or possibly years. Adeline knew she should leave immediately, but her curiosity as a wilderness guide compelled her to investigate further. She had heard rumors about people living completely off-grid in remote areas of the Appalachians, but she had never encountered concrete evidence of such settlements. She approached the cave entrance cautiously, calling out a greeting to announce her presence in case anyone was inside. The only response was silence, but she could see that the cave extended much deeper than the natural light could penetrate. Just inside the entrance, her eyes adjusted enough to see that the cave had been extensively modified for human habitation. The floor had been cleared and leveled, with sleeping areas marked by collections of animal furs and woven grass mats. Crude shelving had been carved or constructed along the walls, holding various containers fashioned from gourds, bark, and animal bladders. Most shocking were the tools and weapons arranged near what appeared to be a central gathering area. Spears tipped with sharpened stones, primitive knives, and various snares and traps that looked both effective and recently used. The sound of approaching footsteps from deep within the cave system made Adeline freeze with terror. The footsteps were accompanied by low voices, speaking in what sounded like a corrupted version of English, mixed with sounds that were barely recognizable as human language. She realized with growing horror that the cave's inhabitants were returning, and she was trapped in their dwelling with no clear escape route. She pressed herself against the cave wall near the entrance, hoping to remain unseen until the voices passed, but the footsteps were clearly approaching her location. As the voices grew louder, she could distinguish at least 3 different speakers, including what sounded like a woman and possibly children. Their conversation was incomprehensible but urgent, as if they were discussing something important or making plans. When the first figure emerged from the deeper recesses of the cave, Adeline understood immediately that these were not ordinary people living an alternative lifestyle. The man who appeared was tall and gaunt, with long gray hair and beard matted with dirt and debris. His clothing consisted of animal skins held together with crude stitching, and his movements had an odd, predatory quality that suggested years of living by hunting and scavenging. Most disturbing were his eyes, which showed intelligence, but none of the social awareness that characterized normal human interaction. Behind him came a woman of indeterminate age, her hair hanging in matted ropes around a face marked by exposure and hardship. She carried what appeared to be fresh meat from a recent kill, and her hands and arms were stained with blood that looked far too fresh to have come from any legal hunting activity. Following her were two younger individuals who moved with the same unsettling combination of human intelligence and animal instinct. Adeline realized that she was witnessing a family group that had lived in complete isolation for so long that they had developed their own culture and survival methods completely outside the boundaries of civilized society. Their tools, their shelter modifications, and their apparent hunting success suggested years or possibly decades of self-sufficiency in the wilderness. But there was something in their behavior, their movements, and their vocalizations that indicated they had moved beyond simple survival into something more primitive and potentially dangerous. The moment they noticed her presence, their entire demeanor changed. The casual conversation stopped abruptly, and all four individuals focused on her with an intensity that made her understand she was being evaluated as either threat or prey. They did not approach her directly, but began moving to positions that would cut off her access to the cave entrance, demonstrating tactical thinking that suggested they had dealt with intruders before. Adeline knew her survival depended on leaving immediately before they could complete whatever coordination they were attempting. She backed toward the cave entrance slowly, keeping her movements non-threatening while maintaining eye contact with the apparent leader. When she reached the entrance, she turned and ran with everything she had, crashing through the rhododendron bushes and following the path back the way she had come. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of pursuit, but not the heavy footfalls of people running along the same path. Instead, she heard movement through the forest itself, parallel to her route but hidden in the dense undergrowth. They were following her, but they were using their intimate knowledge of the terrain to track her, while remaining unseen. The realization that they could probably overtake her at any time made her push harder, despite the burning in her lungs and the growing fatigue in her legs. After what felt like hours of desperate flight, she finally spotted familiar trail markers and realized she had found her way back to the official Appalachian Trail. Her GPS unit immediately locked onto satellite signals and confirmed her location, showing that she had traveled nearly 5 miles from her intended route. She continued hiking at maximum speed until she reached the parking area where her truck was waiting, and she did not feel truly safe until she was driving down the mountain road toward civilization. Adeline never reported her encounter to the authorities, knowing that her story would be difficult to believe without concrete evidence. She continued hiking in other areas, but never returned to that particular section of the North Carolina mountains. Sometimes, when she was leading guided hikes in other locations, she would catch herself scanning the tree lines and listening for sounds that did not belong, wondering how many other settlements might exist in the vast wilderness areas where few people ventured and fewer still returned to tell about what they had discovered. Keelan had been bow hunting in the Tennessee mountains for over 20 years, ever since his father first took him out as a teenager. As a certified bow hunter education instructor and member of the Tennessee Bow Hunters Association, he knew these woods better than most people knew their own backyards. He had harvested dozens of deer, turkey, and bear from the same hunting grounds in the Cherokee National Forest, always following ethical hunting practices and maintaining the deepest respect for the wildlife and ecosystem he was entering. The hunting lease he shared with 5 other experienced hunters covered nearly 3,000 acres of pristine wilderness in the Unicoi Mountains, about 40 miles southeast of Knoxville. The property had been in their hunting club for over 15 years, and they had developed an intimate knowledge of every ridge, hollow, creek bed, and game trail across the entire tract. They maintained several permanent tree stands, ground blinds, and a small hunting cabin where they could process game and wait out bad weather. This particular October morning started like countless others over the years. Killian arrived at the cabin well before dawn, checked his equipment one final time, and headed out to his favorite stand, overlooking a natural funnel where deer moved between bedding and feeding areas. The weather was perfect for bow hunting. Cool, still air with just enough breeze to mask his scent, and the kind of overcast sky that kept deer moving throughout the morning hours. He reached his tree stand in complete darkness, climbed the 20 feet to his platform, and settled in for what he hoped would be a productive morning. The stand was positioned on the edge of a steep ridge, giving him visibility across a small valley where several game trails converged near a seasonal creek. He had taken his largest buck from this exact location 3 years earlier, and the area consistently produced opportunities during the peak of the rut. As the sky began to lighten, Killian started noticing things that seemed out of place. There were fresh disturbances in the forest floor below his stand, but they did not look like normal deer sign or the tracks of other common wildlife. The ground showed evidence of digging, but not the kind of rooting behavior he would expect from wild hogs or bears. Someone or something had been systematically excavating small holes and then carefully covering them with branches and leaves. When full daylight arrived, he realized he was looking at a network of primitive traps and snares that extended throughout the area around his tree stand. The devices were expertly constructed using materials found in the forest, bent saplings, carefully balanced deadfalls, and concealed pits lined with sharpened stakes. The craftsmanship was impressive, showing knowledge of animal behavior and woodland engineering that went far beyond anything he had seen in survival manuals or primitive skills demonstrations. More disturbing than the traps themselves was the evidence of their success. Several of the devices showed signs of recent use, with bloodstains, tufts of animal hair, and drag marks leading away from the trigger mechanisms. Whatever had built these traps was actively using them to capture game in an area where Killian and his hunting partners had been operating for years without any knowledge of another person's presence. As Killian studied the trap network from his elevated position, he began to notice other modifications to the natural environment that suggested long-term habitation. Trees had been deliberately damaged or killed to create sightlines and travel corridors. Certain areas showed evidence of controlled burning to encourage new growth that would attract deer and other game animals. Someone had been managing this forest with the same systematic approach that professional wildlife biologists used, but using methods that were completely primitive and undetectable to casual observation. The realization that he was hunting in someone else's territory made him profoundly uncomfortable. He had always been scrupulous about respecting property boundaries and hunting regulations, and the idea that he might be trespassing on another person's subsistence hunting grounds violated his personal ethics. But the sophistication and extent of the modifications suggested that whoever was responsible had been working in this area for years, possibly decades, without any contact with the outside world. Around mid-morning, he heard the first human sounds. They were not the voices of other hunters or hikers, but something much more primitive and disturbing. The sounds included whistles, clicks, and calls that seemed designed to communicate over long distances without alerting prey animals. The vocalizations were clearly coordinated, suggesting multiple individuals working together to drive game toward specific locations where the trap networks were most dense. Killian remained motionless in his tree stand, watching and listening as the sounds moved through the forest in patterns that indicated sophisticated hunting tactics. The individuals making the sounds were herding deer and other animals along specific routes, using the terrain and their intimate knowledge of animal behavior to funnel their prey into killing zones. Their methods were more effective than anything he had learned in 2 decades of hunting experience. When he finally saw the first figure, Killian understood immediately that he was dealing with something far beyond his experience or preparation. The man who emerged from the forest canopy moved with the fluid grace of someone who had spent years perfecting the art of moving silently through dense woodland. He was tall and lean, wearing clothing fashioned entirely from animal hides and plant fibers, with long hair bound back with what appeared to be sinew or woven grass. What made the sight truly unsettling was not just the man's primitive appearance, but his complete integration with the forest environment. His movements were perfectly timed to the natural rhythms of the woodland, and he seemed to understand exactly where every branch, rock, and obstacle was positioned without looking. This was someone who had lived in these mountains long enough to become part of the ecosystem itself. Behind the first man came others, moving in coordinated formation through the forest with military precision. Killian counted at least 6 individuals, including women, and what appeared to be adolescents, all moving with the same supernatural stealth and environmental awareness. They carried weapons that were primitive but obviously effective: longbows constructed from local woods, spears tipped with napped stone points, and various tools that looked both ancient and perfectly functional. From his position 20 feet above the forest floor, Killian watched as they systematically checked their trap network, collecting game and resetting triggers with practiced efficiency. Their methods were brutal but effective, designed to capture and kill prey animals with minimal suffering and maximum resource utilization. Every part of each animal was used or preserved for future use, demonstrating a level of subsistence living that most people could not imagine in the modern world. The group's coordination and communication suggested a social structure that had evolved over years of cooperative survival. They used hand signals, subtle vocalizations, and body language that indicated complex relationships and established hierarchies within their community. This was not a collection of individuals living rough, but an organized society that had developed its own culture and survival methods completely outside the boundaries of civilization. When they began marking territory, Killian realized the true extent of his danger. The group was systematically hanging animal skulls and bones from tree branches, creating a perimeter of warnings that clearly communicated ownership and territorial boundaries. The markers were placed with obvious intent to be visible to any other humans who might enter the area, and their message was unmistakable. This land was claimed and defended. More disturbing were the human artifacts mixed among the animal remains. Killian could see pieces of modern equipment that had obviously been taken from other hunters or hikers, fragments of camouflage clothing, pieces of metal hunting implements, and other items that suggested previous encounters with people who had ventured into this territory. The implications of those trophies made his blood run cold. As the group completed their circuit of the trap network and began moving toward his location, Killian realized that his tree stand had been detected. The leader was studying the area around the base of his tree with obvious interest, examining the rope ladder and other equipment that marked his presence. Their discovery of his location was systematic and methodical, suggesting that they had been aware of his intrusion from the moment he entered their territory. The group began positioning themselves around his tree in a formation that would prevent escape, demonstrating tactical thinking that indicated they had dealt with intruders before. Their movements were coordinated without any visible or audible communication, suggesting a level of cooperation that came from years of working together in life-threatening situations. Killian remained motionless in his stand, knowing that any movement would confirm his presence and possibly trigger an immediate attack. He could see that several of the individuals below were armed with bows and spears, and their positioning indicated they were prepared to use their weapons if necessary. The situation had evolved from uncomfortable to genuinely life-threatening in a matter of minutes. For nearly an hour, he waited in absolute stillness while the group maintained their positions around his tree. They showed no impatience or uncertainty, demonstrating the kind of persistence that came from years of hunting both animals and possibly human intruders. Their patience was inhuman, suggesting that they could maintain their vigil for hours or even days if necessary. When they finally began to withdraw, it was with the same coordinated precision they had shown throughout their entire operation. They did not simply leave the area, but systematically erased all evidence of their presence while maintaining surveillance on his location. Their departure was so skillfully executed that within minutes, the forest appeared exactly as it had before their arrival. Killian waited until well past sunset before climbing down from his tree stand, and he moved through the forest with more caution than he had ever exercised in 2 decades of hunting. Every shadow could conceal a watcher. Every sound could signal the approach of someone who viewed him as an intruder in their domain. He reached his truck without incident, but he could feel eyes following his movement all the way to the parking area. He never returned to that hunting lease, despite losing his share of the membership fees and disappointing his longtime hunting partners. He continued bow hunting in other areas, but he never again entered the woods without wondering what other territories might be claimed and defended by people who had chosen to live completely outside the boundaries of modern society. Jalen had been looking forward to this camping trip for months. After completing his first semester of graduate school at East Tennessee State University, he needed time away from textbooks, research papers, and the constant pressure of academic deadlines. His girlfriend Sarah had suggested they spend a long weekend in the Daniel Boone National Forest, camping at one of the backcountry sites that required a moderate hike to reach, but offered complete privacy and stunning mountain views. They had been dating for 2 years, and this trip represented something special for both of them. Sarah was finishing her nursing degree, and they rarely had time together without the distractions of school, work, and social obligations. The idea of 3 days with no cell phone service, no internet, and nothing but each other and the natural beauty of the Kentucky mountains seemed like exactly what their relationship needed. Jalen had researched the location extensively, choosing a campsite near Red River Gorge that was accessible by a well-marked trail, but far enough from the main camping areas to ensure solitude. The site sat on a small bluff overlooking the river valley, with a natural windbreak of ancient hemlocks and a reliable water source just a few hundred yards down the slope. According to the guidebooks and online reviews, it was one of the most beautiful and peaceful spots in the entire national forest. They arrived at the trailhead on a Friday afternoon in early November, when the fall colors were at their peak and the weather was cool enough for comfortable hiking, but not so cold that camping would be miserable. The 3-mile hike to their chosen campsite took them through some of the most spectacular scenery either of them had ever experienced, with towering sandstone cliffs, cascading waterfalls, and forest floors carpeted in brilliant yellow and orange leaves. The campsite exceeded their expectations. The natural clearing was just large enough for their tent and a small campfire ring that previous visitors had constructed from local stones. The view across the valley was breathtaking, with layers of ridges extending to the horizon and no signs of human development visible in any direction. They set up camp with the efficiency that came from several previous backpacking trips together, establishing their tent, organizing their gear, and collecting firewood before darkness fell. Their first night passed peacefully. They cooked dinner over their camp stove, shared a bottle of wine they had packed specifically for the occasion, and spent hours talking by the fire about their future plans and dreams. The sounds of the forest were exactly what they had hoped for. The gentle rustle of leaves, the distant call of owls, and the soft murmur of the river far below their campsite. When they finally retreated to their tent around midnight, they both felt more relaxed and connected than they had in months. The first sign that something was wrong came during the second night. Jalen was awakened around 2 a.m. by sounds that seemed out of place in the natural environment. At first, he thought he was hearing other campers, despite the remoteness of their location. The sounds included what seemed like whispered conversations, the crackle of a fire, and the movement of people around a campsite. But as he listened more carefully, he realized that the sounds were coming from multiple directions simultaneously, as if they were surrounded by several different groups. Sarah stirred beside him, also awakened by the unusual sounds. They lay quietly in their sleeping bags, listening and trying to determine what they were hearing. The whispered conversations continued, but they were too distant and distorted to make out actual words. More disturbing was the realization that the conversations seemed to be moving, circling their campsite at a distance of maybe 50 or 100 yards. Jalen unzipped the tent flap slightly and peered outside, but the darkness was complete, and he could see nothing beyond the faint glow of their banked campfire. The sounds continued for nearly an hour before gradually fading away, leaving them both wide awake and uncomfortable. They discussed what they had heard, and trying to convince themselves that it had been other backpackers passing through the area, or perhaps the distorted echoes of their own voices carrying through the valley. The next morning brought reassurance and doubt in equal measure. Their campsite showed no signs of intrusion, and everything appeared exactly as they had left it the night before. But as they explored the area around their site, they discovered evidence that other people had been nearby recently. There were footprints in the soft earth near the water source, but they were not the prints of hiking boots or any other modern footwear. Instead, they appeared to have been made by bare feet or very primitive shoes constructed from animal hide. More unsettling were the other signs they found. Small piles of stones arranged in patterns that seemed deliberately placed, scratches on tree bark that looked intentionally made, and areas where vegetation had been disturbed in ways that suggested human activity but not the kind associated with normal camping or hiking. The evidence pointed to the presence of people who were living in the forest, using methods and materials that had nothing to do with modern outdoor recreation. Sarah wanted to pack up and leave immediately, but Jalen convinced her that they were probably seeing the remains of some kind of primitive skills workshop or historical reenactment event. He suggested that the sounds they had heard might have been participants in such an event moving through the area during the night. His explanation was plausible enough to ease her immediate fears, and they decided to stay for their planned final night. That decision proved to be a terrible mistake. The attack came just after sunset on their third night, when they were sitting by their campfire preparing dinner. The assault was swift, coordinated, and executed with a level of tactical sophistication that suggested extensive planning and experience with similar attacks. The first indication of danger was the simultaneous extinguishing of their campfire and their battery-powered lantern, plunging them into complete darkness. Before they could react or even understand what had happened, they heard movement all around their campsite, the sound of multiple individuals moving through the forest with remarkable stealth and coordination. The sounds came from at least 4 different directions, indicating that they were surrounded by people who had approached their position without making any detectable noise. Jalen grabbed Sarah's hand and tried to guide her toward their tent, where they had stored their emergency supplies, including a powerful flashlight and a whistle for signaling rescue. But before they could reach the tent, they heard the sound of fabric ripping and realized that their shelter was being systematically destroyed by unseen attackers. Their sleeping bags, clothing, and gear were being scattered or damaged, eliminating any possibility of retreat or protection. The attack escalated when the first thrown object struck Jalen in the shoulder. The projectile was a rock about the size of a baseball thrown with enough force to cause immediate pain and disorientation. More rocks followed from multiple directions, forcing him and Sarah to crouch low and try to shield themselves with their arms. The barrage was not random or wild, but carefully aimed to herd them toward a specific area of the campsite. In the brief moments between volleys of thrown stones, Jalen could hear vocalizations that were clearly human, but unlike any language he had ever encountered. The sounds included whistles, clicks, and guttural calls that seemed to coordinate the attack and communicate tactical information between the attackers. The coordination was flawless, suggesting that the individuals conducting the assault had worked together in similar situations many times before. When the stone throwing stopped, the attackers began to close in. Jalen could hear them moving through the darkness, approaching from all sides with the confidence of predators who knew their prey was trapped. He grabbed a burning branch from the scattered remains of their campfire, using it as both a weapon and a source of light, and saw his first clear glimpse of their attackers. The figures that emerged from the darkness were human, but they moved and behaved in ways that seemed barely civilized. They were small in stature, possibly children or adolescents, wearing clothing fashioned from animal hides and plant materials. Their movements were coordinated and purposeful, like a pack of predators that had learned to hunt cooperatively. Most disturbing was their complete lack of fear or hesitation in the presence of adults who were larger and presumably stronger than they were. Jalen swung the burning branch at the nearest attacker, connecting solidly enough to send the figure sprawling backward with a cry of pain and surprise. The temporary success gave him enough time to grab Sarah and begin moving toward the trail that would take them back to civilization. But the attackers regrouped immediately, following them through the darkness and continuing their assault with thrown objects in coordinated attempts to cut off their escape routes. The 3-mile hike back to their vehicle became a running battle through complete darkness. Their attackers demonstrated an intimate knowledge of the terrain that allowed them to move through the forest without difficulty, while Jalen and Sarah stumbled over roots, rocks, and fallen logs. The pursuit continued for the entire distance, with their attackers maintaining constant pressure, but never quite closing the distance enough for direct physical confrontation. The most terrifying aspect of the entire ordeal was the realization that their attackers were playing with them, demonstrating their superiority and control over the situation without actually inflicting serious harm. The thrown rocks were aimed to hurt and intimidate rather than to cause permanent injury. The pursuit was relentless but carefully managed to prevent them from stopping to rest, while never quite allowing them to escape entirely. When they finally reached their car in the parking area, their attackers melted back into the forest as silently as they had appeared. Jalen and Sarah drove directly to the nearest town and reported the incident to local law enforcement. But their story was met with skepticism and suggestions that they had probably encountered a group of local teenagers engaged in some kind of prank or initiation ritual. No investigation was conducted, and no other incidents were reported from the same area. Jalen and Sarah never returned to the Daniel Boone National Forest, and their relationship struggled to recover from the trauma of the experience. The attack had shown them that the wilderness they thought they understood could harbor dangers that had nothing to do with weather, wildlife, or natural hazards, but rather with human beings who had chosen to live completely outside the boundaries of civilized society. Kyson had been working as a traveling pharmaceutical sales representative for nearly 8 years, covering a territory that stretched across rural Virginia, West Virginia, and eastern Kentucky. His job required him to visit small-town doctors, clinics, and hospitals in some of the most remote areas of Appalachia, often driving hundreds of miles on winding mountain roads that barely appeared on GPS maps. He prided himself on his reliability and his ability to reach any medical facility, no matter how isolated or difficult to access. The territory had its challenges, But Kyson genuinely enjoyed the work and the people he met in these mountain communities. The doctors and nurses he worked with were often dealing with limited resources and challenging patient populations, and they appreciated his willingness to make the effort to reach them with information about new medications and treatment options. His success in the territory had earned him recognition from his company and a reputation as someone who could handle the most difficult assignments. On this particular November morning, Kyson was driving from a clinic in Wise, Virginia, to a small hospital in Pikeville, Kentucky, following a route that would take him through some of the most remote sections of the Cumberland Mountains. The journey normally took about 3 hours on good roads, but this route required him to use several mountain roads that were more like improved logging trails than proper highways. His GPS showed the route as a series of thin gray lines winding through areas marked as national forest land. The weather had been unseasonably warm for November, with temperatures in the 60s and partly cloudy skies that made for pleasant driving through the spectacular fall foliage. Kyson had made this particular trip dozens of times over the years and knew most of the landmarks and hazards along the route. He was listening to a podcast about new pharmaceutical research and making good time when his car began making unusual sounds from the engine compartment. The initial symptoms were subtle, a slight knocking sound that came and went, occasionally accompanied by a brief loss of power when climbing the steeper grades. Kyson was driving a reliable sedan with relatively low mileage that had never given him serious mechanical problems, so he assumed the issues were related to the high altitude and steep terrain rather than any fundamental mechanical failure. He reduced his speed and continued driving, hoping to reach the next town before the problems became serious. But the symptoms rapidly worsened. The knocking became constant and loud enough to be heard over the road noise and his podcast. The engine began losing power more frequently and for longer periods, forcing him to downshift and struggle to maintain even modest speeds on the uphill sections. By the time he realized that he was dealing with a serious mechanical failure, he was deep in the mountains on a narrow road with no cell phone service and no recent memory of passing any houses, businesses, or other signs of civilization. When the engine finally seized completely, Kyson was climbing a particularly steep and winding section of mountain road with deep forest on both sides and no visible structures or cleared land anywhere in sight. The car rolled to a stop in the middle of the narrow asphalt road, which was barely wide enough for 2 vehicles to pass safely. He tried repeatedly to restart the engine, but it would not even turn over, and he could smell burning oil and coolant that indicated catastrophic internal damage. His cell phone showed no signal, which was not unusual in these mountains, but was particularly frustrating given his current situation. He estimated that he was at least 20 miles from the nearest town in either direction, and the road saw very little traffic during weekday hours. Most of the vehicles that used this route were local residents who knew to avoid it during certain times of day when coal trucks and logging vehicles made it dangerous for passenger cars. Kyson decided to walk back down the mountain toward the last town he had passed through, figuring that downhill walking would be easier than trying to climb toward an unknown destination. He locked his car, gathered his important documents and medications from his sample case, and began walking back along the route he had just driven. The road was well maintained and the walking was not difficult, but he realized that it might be several hours before he reached any place where he could get help or cell phone service. After walking for about an hour, he encountered the first house he had seen since his car broke down. The structure was set back from the road about 50 yards, connected by a dirt driveway that wound through dense trees. The house itself was modest but well maintained, with a metal roof and what appeared to be a recent addition on one side. Most importantly, there was a light visible in one of the windows, indicating that someone was home. Kyson walked up the driveway and knocked on the front door, planning to explain his situation and ask to use a phone or get directions to the nearest town with a garage or towing service. When the door opened, he found himself looking at a woman who appeared to be in her 40s or 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a simple ponytail and wearing clean but well-worn clothing. She looked at him with obvious suspicion but not immediate hostility. He introduced himself and explained that his car had broken down about a mile up the road and he was hoping to call for assistance or get directions to the nearest town. The woman listened to his story without comment, studying him with an intensity that made him uncomfortable. Her eyes moved from his face to his clothing to the sample case he was carrying, and he had the distinct impression that she was evaluating him according to criteria he could not understand. After a long pause, she introduced herself as Charlene and invited him inside to use the phone. The interior of the house was sparse but clean, with furniture that looked handmade and decorations that seemed to consist entirely of crafts made from natural materials. What struck Kyson most was the absence of any modern conveniences. No television, no computer, no appliances visible except for what appeared to be a wood-burning stove for heating and cooking. Charlene directed him to an old rotary telephone mounted on the kitchen wall, but when he picked up the receiver, there was no dial tone. She explained that the phone service had been disconnected several months earlier because she no longer needed to communicate with the outside world. Her explanation was matter-of-fact, delivered without any indication that she understood how unusual or disturbing her statement might sound to a stranger seeking help. She offered him coffee and suggested that he rest for a while before continuing his walk to town. The coffee was strong and bitter, brewed in a metal pot on the wood stove and served in a chipped ceramic mug that looked handmade. As they talked, Kyson began to realize that Charlene had been living in complete isolation for an extended period, possibly years, with minimal contact with the outside world and limited understanding of current events or social norms. Her conversation revealed a worldview that was increasingly disconnected from reality. She spoke about the corruption and danger of modern society, the importance of self-sufficiency, and her belief that people who lived in cities or worked for large corporations were fundamentally weak and morally compromised. She seemed particularly interested in his work as a pharmaceutical salesman, asking detailed questions about his territory, his schedule, and his personal background. As the conversation continued, Kyson began to feel increasingly uncomfortable with the direction of her questions and comments. She asked about his family, where he lived, and whether anyone knew exactly where he was traveling that day. She wanted to know about his car, his finances, and his connections to law enforcement or government agencies. Her curiosity seemed to go far beyond normal social interest and suggested that she was gathering information for some specific purpose. When he mentioned that he should continue walking toward town before it got dark, Charlene became more insistent that he stay longer. She offered him dinner and suggested that he spend the night and continue his journey in the morning, when it would be safer to walk along the mountain roads. Her hospitality seemed genuine, but there was an underlying urgency to her suggestions that made him suspect her motives. The turning point came when he excused himself to use the bathroom and discovered that the back rooms of the house contained evidence that other travelers had visited recently. There were personal items that obviously did not belong to Charlene. Men's clothing, wallets, keys, and other possessions that appeared to have been collected from multiple individuals over an extended period. Most disturbing were the driver's licenses and identification cards from at least 6 different men, all appearing to be middle-aged professionals who might have been traveling through the area on business. Kyson realized with growing horror that Charlene had been systematically targeting stranded travelers, using her isolated location and apparent helplessness to lure people into her house where she could rob them or worse. The collection of personal items suggested that her activities had been ongoing for months or years, and the fact that none of the identification belonged to local residents indicated that she specifically targeted people who were unlikely to be missed immediately. He returned to the kitchen and told Charlene that he had decided to continue walking while there was still daylight, despite her continued insistence that he stay longer. Her demeanor changed immediately when she realized that he was determined to leave. The friendly concern was replaced by a cold calculation that confirmed his suspicions about her true intentions. She positioned herself between him and the front door, and he noticed for the first time that she had easy access to several potential weapons, including kitchen knives and what appeared to be a hunting rifle mounted on the wall. The conversation became a careful negotiation in which Kyson tried to maintain the appearance of gratitude for her hospitality, while making it clear that he was determined to leave immediately. Charlene alternated between friendly persuasion and barely concealed threats, suggesting that the mountain roads were dangerous at night and that he might encounter wildlife or other hazards that could be fatal for someone unfamiliar with the area. When he finally insisted on leaving, despite her objections, she followed him outside and continued trying to convince him to return. Her persistence crossed the line from concern into obvious predatory behavior, and Kyson realized that his survival might depend on his ability to get away from her property without provoking a direct confrontation. He thanked her repeatedly for her kindness and promised to send help or payment for her assistance once he reached town. Charlene watched him walk down her driveway and disappear around the bend in the road, but Kyson had the distinct feeling that his departure had not ended her interest in him. He walked as quickly as possible while still appearing casual, expecting at any moment to hear footsteps behind him or see her vehicle approaching from either direction. The realization that she knew these roads far better than he did and could easily intercept him at any point made every step feel dangerous. After walking for another 2 hours, he finally reached a town with a working gas station and was able to call for a tow truck and arrange transportation to his destination. When he told the tow truck driver about his encounter with Charlene, the man's expression became serious, and he advised Kyson to report the incident to local law enforcement. According to the driver, several travelers had gone missing in that area over the past few years, and there had been rumors about a woman who targeted stranded motorists. Kyson never learned whether Charlene was investigated or arrested, but he changed his travel routes to avoid that section of mountain road entirely. His experience had shown him that the isolation that made Appalachian communities special could also provide cover for predators who targeted the vulnerable and unwary. Kyson had never been particularly close to his grandfather, but the old man had left him the family cabin in his will, along with 40 acres of mountain land in the remote hills of West Virginia. The property had been in the family for 3 generations, originally purchased by his great-grandfather as a hunting retreat back in the 1940s, when land in the Monongahela National Forest was cheap and the area was even more isolated than it was today. The cabin itself was a modest structure built from local timber, with a stone foundation and a metal roof that had been added sometime in the 1980s. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, accessible only by a dirt road that wound through the mountains for nearly 8 miles before connecting to the nearest paved highway. Kyson had visited the property only twice as a child, both times for brief family gatherings that had ended in arguments between his father and grandfather about money, politics, and family obligations. Now, at 32 years old and recently divorced, Kyson found himself the sole owner of property that was worth more than he had expected, but also came with responsibilities he had not anticipated. The county tax assessor had informed him that the cabin and land were valued at nearly $200,000, but maintaining the property would require regular visits to check on the structure, clear fallen trees from the access road, and ensure that squatters or vandals had not taken up residence. His first trip to inspect his inheritance came on a cold February weekend when snow covered the ground and most of the trees were bare, making it easier to see the full extent of the property and assess its condition. The drive up the mountain road took longer than he had expected, with several fallen trees blocking the path and forcing him to stop and clear debris with a chainsaw he had brought specifically for that purpose. When he finally reached the cabin, his first impression was that the building had been remarkably well maintained, despite sitting empty for nearly 2 years since his grandfather's death. The windows were intact. The roof showed no signs of damage, and the front porch appeared solid and safe. The only obvious issue was that someone had built a fire in the outdoor fire pit recently, leaving behind charred logs and ashes that could not have been more than a few weeks old. Kaizan assumed that local hunters or hikers had used the property for shelter or camping, which was not uncommon for remote cabins in the national forest. He made a mental note to post "no trespassing" signs and possibly install a better lock on the front door, but he was not particularly concerned about occasional use by people seeking temporary shelter in the wilderness. The interior of the cabin revealed more extensive evidence of recent occupation. Someone had been living in the building for an extended period, using the wood-burning stove for heat and cooking and sleeping on the old furniture that his grandfather had left behind. The intruders had been relatively careful to avoid obvious damage, but they had clearly made themselves at home, using dishes, bedding, and other household items as if the cabin belonged to them. What disturbed Kaizan most was not the evidence of habitation, but the nature of the modifications that had been made to the building. The windows had been covered with heavy blankets and tarps, blocking all natural light and making it impossible for anyone outside to see into the cabin. Furniture had been rearranged to create what appeared to be defensive positions, with clear sight lines to all entrances. Most unsettling were the crude weapons that had been fashioned from household items. Kitchen knives attached to broom handles, sharpened fireplace tools, and improvised clubs made from furniture legs. The basement revealed the full extent of the intrusion. What had once been a simple storage area had been converted into a living space with sleeping areas, food storage, and what appeared to be a workshop for creating tools and weapons from scavenged materials. The work was sophisticated and extensive, suggesting that whoever had taken up residence had been planning to stay indefinitely and was prepared to defend their occupation against any attempts to evict them. More disturbing were the remains of animals that had been processed and stored throughout the basement. Deer, rabbits, and other game animals had been skinned, butchered, and preserved using methods that indicated extensive knowledge of wilderness survival techniques. The quantity of meat and the systematic approach to processing suggested that multiple people had been living in the cabin for months, possibly since shortly after his grandfather's death. As Kaizan explored the basement more thoroughly, he discovered evidence that the occupants had not limited their activities to the cabin itself. Tunnels had been dug under the foundation, extending in multiple directions and creating what appeared to be an underground network of passages and chambers. The excavation work was extensive and sophisticated, requiring months of labor and indicating a level of commitment to the property that went far beyond temporary squatting. The tunnels were reinforced with timber and equipped with crude lighting systems powered by car batteries. Some passages led to hidden entrances outside the cabin, while others connected to what appeared to be underground storage areas and workshops. The entire system had been designed to allow movement and activities that would be completely invisible to anyone observing the property from above ground. The realization that he was standing in what amounted to an underground compound made Kaizan understand that he was not dealing with casual trespassers or homeless individuals seeking temporary shelter. The people who had taken over his property had invested enormous time and effort into creating a permanent settlement that could support multiple residents for extended periods while remaining hidden from detection by authorities or other outside observers. As he continued exploring the underground passages, Kaizan began hearing sounds that indicated he was not alone on the property. The sounds came from multiple directions and seemed to be moving through the tunnel system around and beneath him. The vocalizations were clearly human, but consisted primarily of whistles, clicks, and guttural communications that suggested people who had developed their own methods of coordination without using normal speech patterns. The realization that the occupants had returned while he was exploring their underground domain filled him with panic. He was trapped in a confined space that they knew intimately while he was completely disoriented and disadvantaged. The tunnel system that had impressed him with its sophistication now seemed like a maze designed to confuse and trap intruders while giving the residents multiple escape routes and tactical advantages. Kaison tried to retrace his path back to the main basement, but the underground passages looked identical in the dim light from his flashlight, and he quickly became lost in the network of tunnels and chambers. The sounds of approaching voices grew louder and more coordinated, suggesting that multiple individuals were converging on his location from different directions. When he finally encountered the first resident, the meeting was unlike anything he could have imagined. The person who appeared in his flashlight beam was clearly human, but had been living underground for so long that normal social behaviors and appearances had been abandoned. The individual was covered in dirt and grime, wearing clothing fashioned from animal hides and scavenged materials, and moving with the fluid grace of someone who had spent months navigating the tunnel system in complete darkness. More disturbing than the person's appearance was their behavior. They showed no fear or surprise at discovering a stranger in their underground domain, but instead studied Kaison with the calculating attention of a predator evaluating potential prey. The individual made no attempt to communicate verbally, but used hand signals and vocalizations to coordinate with others who were approaching through the tunnel system. As more residents appeared from various passages, Kaison realized he was facing a group of people who'd been living completely outside the boundaries of civilized society for an extended period. Their clothing, tools, and behavior indicated years of subsistence living using primitive methods, but their coordination and tactical awareness suggested that they had maintained complex social structures and survival strategies. The group began moving to surround him in the narrow confines of the tunnel, demonstrating that they viewed him as either a threat to be eliminated or a resource to be captured and exploited. Their movements were coordinated without verbal communication, indicating that they had developed their own methods of cooperation that were perfectly adapted to their underground environment. Kaison realized that his survival depended on convincing them that he posed no threat while finding a way to escape from the tunnel system before they could complete whatever they were planning. He began backing toward what he hoped was the direction of the main basement, speaking in calm tones and trying to communicate that he simply wanted to leave and would not report their presence to authorities. The group followed him through the tunnels, maintaining their formation and continuing their silent coordination while showing no indication that they understood or cared about his attempts at communication. Their persistence and tactical discipline suggested that they had dealt with previous intruders and had developed effective methods for handling anyone who discovered their underground settlement. When Kaison finally found his way back to the main basement and then up to the cabin's main floor, he discovered that other members of the group had been waiting for him above ground. The cabin was now occupied by individuals who had been monitoring his exploration and were prepared to prevent his escape. The situation had evolved from uncomfortable to genuinely life-threatening in a matter of minutes. The confrontation that followed was brief but terrifying. The residents made it clear through their actions and positioning that they considered the property to be their territory and that they were prepared to defend it against any attempts to reclaim it. Their weapons, coordination, and obvious experience with similar situations suggested that they had successfully defended their occupation against previous challenges. Kaison's escape came only when he convinced them that he had no interest in the property and would sign over ownership if they would allow him to leave safely. The negotiation was conducted primarily through gestures and actions rather than words, but the residents eventually allowed him to reach his vehicle and leave the property under their continued surveillance. He never returned to the cabin and eventually sold the property to a development company without disclosing what he had discovered there. The buyers never contacted him with questions or complaints, suggesting that they had either successfully evicted the underground residents or had themselves become part of whatever was happening in the tunnels beneath the old family cabin. Colton had been guiding hunting expeditions in the Tennessee mountains for over 12 years, building a reputation as one of the most knowledgeable and reliable outfitters in the Cumberland Plateau region. His business, Mountain Ridge Outfitters, specialized in multi-day bow hunting and rifle hunting trips for trophy whitetail deer, black bear, and wild turkey. He maintained exclusive access to over 5,000 acres of prime hunting land through a network of leases and partnerships with local landowners who appreciated his conservation ethics and professional approach. The hunting party that arrived at his base camp in late November consisted of 4 experienced hunters from Illinois who had booked a 5-day guided expedition targeting trophy whitetail bucks during the peak of the rutting season. The group included Dr. Michael Harrison, a surgeon who had been bow hunting for over 20 years, James Mitchell, a retired military officer with extensive wilderness experience, Robert Chen, a successful businessman who was an accomplished rifle hunter, and David Thompson, a wildlife photographer who combined hunting with his professional documentation of wildlife behavior. All 4 clients had impressive hunting credentials and had specifically requested a challenging backcountry hunt that would take them deep into the most remote sections of Colton's hunting territory. They were well equipped with high-quality gear, physically fit enough to handle demanding terrain, and experienced enough to follow safety protocols without constant supervision. From Colton's perspective, they represented the ideal hunting party: skilled, responsible, and genuinely interested in the wilderness experience rather than just trophy collection. The expedition began at Colton's established base camp, a collection of wall tents and semi-permanent structures situated in a secluded valley about 15 miles from the nearest paved road. The camp was equipped with everything necessary for extended hunting trips: cooking facilities, sleeping quarters, equipment storage, meat processing areas, and communication equipment for emergency situations. Colton had been operating from this location for 8 years and had never experienced serious problems with wildlife, weather, or human interference. The hunting plan called for the group to spend their first 2 days hunting relatively close to base camp, while Colton assessed their skills and adjusted to their individual hunting styles. Days 3 and 4 would take them into more remote areas where trophy animals were more likely to be encountered, but where the hunting would be more physically demanding and potentially dangerous. The 5th day would be reserved for meat processing, packing, and transportation back to civilization. The first day proceeded exactly according to plan. Colton guided the hunters to established stands and ground blinds where they had opportunities to observe deer behavior and assess the quality of animals in the area. Dr. Harrison successfully harvested a mature doe, demonstrating excellent shot placement and field dressing skills. The other hunters saw multiple deer, including several respectable bucks, giving everyone confidence that the expedition would be successful. That evening around the campfire, the conversation turned to stories about previous hunting experiences, wildlife encounters, and the challenges of hunting in different regions. The clients were knowledgeable and entertaining, sharing tales from hunting trips across North America and discussing the differences between hunting pressured deer near urban areas versus hunting truly wild animals in remote wilderness settings. It was during this conversation that Colton first mentioned the unusual signs he had been noticing throughout his hunting territory over the past several months. Game trails that had been used by deer for years had been abandoned without obvious explanation. Natural mineral licks that consistently attracted wildlife had stopped showing animal activity. Most disturbing were the systematic modifications to the forest environment. Trees that had been deliberately damaged to create sightlines and travel corridors, and evidence of controlled burning designed to manage vegetation growth and animal movement. Initially, Colton had assumed that these changes were the result of activities by other hunters, or possibly wildlife management efforts by state forestry officials. But inquiries with local authorities had revealed no authorized activities in his hunting area, and the modifications were too extensive and sophisticated to have been created by casual hunters or poachers. The second day brought the first direct evidence that something was seriously wrong in Colton's hunting territory. While guiding James Mitchell to a tree stand overlooking a natural funnel between feeding and bedding areas, they discovered that the stand had been systematically dismantled and the materials used to construct what appeared to be primitive shelters and defensive positions. The construction was sophisticated and purposeful, using natural materials and camouflage techniques that would be nearly invisible to anyone not looking specifically for signs of human habitation. The shelters were positioned to provide excellent visibility across the hunting area, while remaining concealed from casual observation. Most disturbing was the evidence that these positions had been occupied recently and were being maintained as part of an ongoing operation. As they examined the modified hunting area more closely, Colton and his clients began finding additional evidence of prolonged human presence. The forest floor showed signs of systematic management, with trails maintained and improved for easier travel, and certain areas cleared to encourage specific types of plant growth that would attract game animals. Someone had been living in and managing this forest, using advanced primitive skills and long-term planning. The realization that they were hunting in territory that was already occupied by people who had superior knowledge of the terrain and animal behavior changed the entire dynamic of the expedition. Colton's carefully planned hunting strategies were based on his understanding of normal animal behavior and movement patterns. But if someone else was actively managing and manipulating the wildlife in the area, his traditional approaches would be ineffective. More concerning was the question of how the occupants of the territory would react to the presence of Colton's hunting party. The sophistication of their shelters and forest management suggested that they were not casual squatters or temporary residents, but people who considered the area to be their permanent domain and would likely defend it against intrusion. The first direct contact came on the third day when Robert Chen failed to return from his assigned hunting area at the predetermined time. Colton had positioned him in a ground blind overlooking a creek crossing where trophy bucks frequently traveled during daylight hours. When Chen did not respond to radio calls or appear at the meeting point, Colton and the remaining hunters began a systematic search of the area. They found Chen's hunting equipment abandoned near his assigned position, but there were no signs of struggle or injury. His bow, arrows, and backpack were arranged in a neat pile as if he had placed them there intentionally before leaving. Most disturbing was the complete absence of tracks or other evidence indicating which direction he had gone or whether he had left voluntarily. The search for Chen revealed additional evidence of the sophisticated operation that was controlling Colton's hunting territory. The ground around Chen's abandoned equipment showed signs of careful tracking and surveillance, with multiple sets of footprints indicating that several individuals had been monitoring his position for an extended period before making contact. The tracking skills demonstrated by these footprints were extraordinary, showing the ability to move through dense forest without disturbing vegetation or leaving obvious sign. The individuals responsible for Chen's disappearance had approached his position using natural cover and terrain features, with the skill of military scouts or professional trackers. As darkness approached without any sign of Chen, Colton made the decision to return to base camp and organize a more extensive search using all available resources. He contacted local authorities via satellite phone and requested assistance from search and rescue teams, but he was informed that no resources would be available until the following morning, due to weather conditions and personnel limitations. The night at base camp was tense and sleepless. The remaining hunters maintained a constant watch while Colton monitored radio frequencies and satellite communication systems for any sign of Chen or indication of what had happened to him. Around midnight, they began hearing sounds that indicated they were being observed by multiple individuals positioned around their campsite. The sounds were subtle, but clearly intentional. The snap of twigs, the rustle of leaves, and occasional vocalizations that seemed designed to communicate between observers without alerting the people being watched. The sounds moved in coordinated patterns around the camp, suggesting that several individuals were maintaining surveillance using sophisticated fieldcraft and communication methods. Dr. Harrison, with his military medical training, recognized the sounds as typical of reconnaissance operations and advised the group that they were dealing with people who had extensive experience in tactical situations. The coordination and discipline required for effective surveillance indicated that they were not facing random criminals or mentally unstable individuals, but organized people with specific objectives and methods. The second disappearance occurred just before dawn, when David Thompson left his tent to use the latrine facilities at the edge of the camp. His absence was discovered when the group gathered for breakfast planning, but by then he had been missing for over 2 hours. Like Chen, Thompson had left no signs of struggle or distress, but his personal effects were found arranged in a deliberate pile near the location where he had last been seen. The pattern of the disappearances convinced Colton that his hunting party was being systematically eliminated by people who had complete control over the forest environment and could remove individuals without leaving evidence or witnesses. The sophisticated planning and execution required for such operations indicated that they were dealing with people who had been living in the wilderness for extended periods and had developed skills and capabilities far beyond those of normal outdoor enthusiasts. With only 2 clients remaining and no prospect of immediate assistance from authorities, Colton made the decision to abandon the expedition and attempt to escort Dr. Harrison and James Mitchell back to civilization. The evacuation would require traveling 15 miles through forest that was clearly controlled by hostile individuals with superior knowledge of the terrain and tactical advantages. The journey became a running battle as the group attempted to reach safety while being systematically harassed and attacked by individuals who remained invisible but demonstrated their presence through thrown objects, coordinated noise, and strategic obstacles placed across escape routes. The attackers showed remarkable discipline and tactical sophistication, applying continuous pressure without exposing themselves to identification or retaliation. Dr. Harrison was separated from the group during a particularly intense barrage of thrown rocks and coordinated noise designed to create confusion and panic. Like the previous disappearances, he vanished without leaving any evidence of struggle or clear indication of his fate. Colton and Mitchell continued their escape alone, knowing that they were being herded toward a destination chosen by their attackers rather than following their own route to safety. The final confrontation occurred when Colton and Mitchell reached what they thought was the safety of the main forest road, only to discover that their vehicle had been disabled and their escape route was blocked by individuals who had anticipated their movements and prepared accordingly. The people who emerged from concealment were human but had been living in complete wilderness isolation for so long that normal social behaviors and appearances had been abandoned in favor of survival adaptations that were both impressive and terrifying. Colton and Mitchell's escape was successful only because the attackers chose to allow it, demonstrating their complete control over the situation while sending a clear message that the territory was permanently claimed and defended. Neither man ever learned the fate of their missing companions, and no subsequent searches or investigations revealed any trace of the 3 hunters who had disappeared during the expedition. Amora had been hiking the same section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia for over 6 years, ever since moving to Richmond and discovering that the mountains offered the perfect escape from her demanding career as a pediatric nurse. The 3-mile loop trail near Shenandoah National Park had become her weekly sanctuary, a place where she could decompress from the emotional intensity of working with sick children and their families while getting the exercise and fresh air that kept her mentally and physically healthy. She never hiked alone by choice, but on this particular Saturday morning in early October, her usual hiking partner had canceled due to a family emergency, and Amora decided to make the trip anyway. The weather was perfect for hiking: cool morning temperatures, clear skies, and the kind of crisp autumn air that made the fall colors seem more vibrant and alive. She brought her 4-year-old golden retriever Max, who had accompanied her on dozens of previous hikes and was an experienced trail dog with excellent recall and protective instincts. The trailhead parking area was unusually empty for a weekend morning during peak fall foliage season, but Amora attributed this to the early hour and the fact that many people preferred the more popular trails deeper in the national park. She appreciated having the trail to herself, knowing that Max would have more freedom to explore and that she could hike at her own pace without worrying about other hikers or their dogs. The first mile of the trail proceeded exactly as expected. The path was well marked and familiar, winding through mixed hardwood forest that was ablaze with orange, red, and gold leaves. Max trotted ahead with his usual enthusiasm, occasionally stopping to investigate interesting scents or sounds, but always returning when called. Amora felt her stress and tension melting away as she settled into the familiar rhythm of hiking in the mountains she had come to love. It was during the second mile that she first noticed they were being followed. The sounds were subtle at first, the snap of twigs and rustle of leaves that could have been attributed to wildlife or the wind. But as she listened more carefully, the sounds began to develop patterns that suggested deliberate tracking rather than random animal movement. Someone or something was moving through the forest parallel to the trail, maintaining a consistent distance while matching her pace. Max noticed the sounds before she did, stopping frequently to look back along the trail or stare into the dense forest, with the focused attention that indicated he was tracking something specific. His behavior was not the excited curiosity he showed when encountering normal wildlife, but the alert wariness that suggested he perceived a potential threat. When she called him to continue hiking, he obeyed reluctantly, continuing to look back and show signs of anxiety that were completely out of character. As they continued along the familiar trail, Amora began to realize that the route was not exactly as she remembered it. The trail markers were still present and the general direction seemed correct, but subtle changes in the terrain and vegetation suggested that either her memory was faulty or the trail had been modified since her last visit. The changes were not dramatic enough to be immediately obvious, but they created a growing sense of disorientation that made her question her familiarity with the area. When she reached what should have been the halfway point of the loop, marked by a distinctive rock formation and wooden bridge over a small creek, neither landmark was where she expected to find it. The trail continued straight ahead through forest that looked similar to what she remembered, but the specific features she used for navigation were absent. Her GPS unit showed that she was in approximately the right location, but the satellite reception was poor and the readings were inconsistent. The realization that she might be lost on a trail she had hiked dozens of times was both frustrating and genuinely concerning. She had never experienced navigation problems in this area, and she had been careful to start her hike from the same trailhead parking area she always used. The possibility that she had somehow taken a wrong turn or followed an unmarked side trail without noticing seemed unlikely, but she could not explain how she had ended up in unfamiliar terrain. As she stopped to examine her map and GPS more carefully, the sounds of her unseen follower became more distinct and obviously intentional. The tracking was no longer subtle or concealed, but had evolved into open surveillance by someone who wanted her to know she was being watched. The sounds included animal calls that seemed designed to communicate her location and movement to others who might be positioned elsewhere along the trail. Max's behavior became increasingly agitated as the vocalizations continued. He was no longer just alert and wary, but actively frightened by sounds that he could not identify or understand. His fear was contagious, creating a feedback loop that increased Amura's own anxiety and made it difficult for her to think clearly about her situation or make rational decisions about how to respond. When she decided to turn around and retrace her route back to the parking area, she discovered that the trail behind her had changed as dramatically as the trail ahead. The path she had followed for the first 2 miles no longer looked familiar, and the landmarks she had passed on her way into the forest were no longer visible. The trail markers were still present, but they seemed to be leading in a direction that did not correspond to her memory of the route or her understanding of the area's geography. The systematic disorientation she was experiencing went beyond normal confusion about trail routes or temporary loss of navigation skills. Someone had deliberately modified the trail system to create a maze that would confuse and trap hikers who were familiar with the area. The modifications were sophisticated and extensive, requiring detailed knowledge of the terrain and considerable time and effort to implement effectively. As she continued trying to find her way back to familiar territory, the animal calls that had been following her became more complex and obviously coordinated. The vocalizations were coming from multiple directions and seemed to be directing her movement along specific routes while blocking access to others. She was being herded like prey, guided toward a destination chosen by whoever was controlling the sounds. Max's protective instincts finally overcame his fear when the first human figure appeared on the trail ahead of them. The person was partially concealed behind a large tree, but Amura could see enough to determine that they were wearing primitive clothing and moving with the fluid stealth of someone who had spent considerable time living in the forest. Max began barking aggressively and positioning himself between Amura and the figure, demonstrating the protective behavior that had been bred into golden retrievers for generations. The appearance of the first tracker was quickly followed by others, emerging from concealed positions throughout the forest around them. Amura found herself surrounded by at least 4 or 5 individuals who had been monitoring her movement and coordinating their positions using the animal calls she'd been hearing. Their ability to remain hidden until they chose to reveal themselves indicated sophisticated fieldcraft and extensive experience with tracking and surveillance. The individuals who surrounded her were clearly human, but their appearance and behavior suggested people who had been living in complete wilderness isolation for an extended period. They wore clothing fashioned from animal hides and plant materials, carried primitive weapons and tools, and moved with the coordinated precision of predators who had learned to hunt cooperatively. Most disturbing was their complete lack of fear or hesitation in confronting a stranger with a large, aggressive dog. The confrontation that followed was brief but terrifying. The trackers demonstrated that they had no interest in communication or negotiation, but were focused on capturing both Amura and Max, using methods that indicated extensive experience with similar situations. They moved to surround them using tactics that suggested military training or years of practice hunting both animals and humans. Max's aggressive defense of his owner provided the distraction necessary for their escape. His attack on the nearest tracker was fierce enough to cause injury and confusion, giving Amura the opportunity to break through their circle and begin running back along the trail toward what she hoped was the direction of the parking area. The trackers regrouped quickly and began pursuit, but Max's continued harassment and the density of the forest vegetation gave them enough of a head start to avoid immediate capture. The pursuit continued for over an hour as Amura and Max struggled to find their way through forest that seemed to have been deliberately modified to confuse and trap them. The trail system had been changed so extensively that normal navigation methods were useless, and their pursuers demonstrated intimate knowledge of the terrain that gave them enormous tactical advantages. Their escape came only when they encountered a group of legitimate hikers who were following a different trail system and were able to provide directions back to the main park roads. The presence of witnesses caused their pursuers to abandon the chase, melting back into the forest with the same stealth they had shown throughout the encounter. Amura reported the incident to park rangers and local law enforcement, but her description of modified trails and coordinated tracking by primitive hunters was met with skepticism and suggestions that she had simply become disoriented and encountered local residents engaged in legal hunting activities. No investigation was conducted, and no other hikers reported similar experiences in the area. She never returned to that section of the Appalachian Trail, despite having considered it her favorite hiking location for years. The experience had shown her that even familiar wilderness areas could harbor dangers that went beyond weather, wildlife, or natural hazards, and included human threats that were far more sophisticated and dangerous than anything she had imagined possible. Aviana had been planning this family camping trip for months, looking forward to spending quality time with her 8-year-old daughter Emma and 6-year-old son Tyler in the beautiful mountains of North Carolina. As a single mother working as a respiratory therapist at Duke University Hospital, she rarely had extended time away from work and the demands of raising 2 children on her own. The 3-day camping trip to Pisgah National Forest represented a much-needed break from the stress of her job and an opportunity to create lasting memories with her kids. She had chosen Mortimer Campground specifically because it was designed for families, with established campsites, clean restroom facilities, and a playground where the children could safely play while she set up their tent and organized their gear. The campground was popular with families from across the Southeast, and she felt confident that it would provide the perfect balance of outdoor adventure and safety that she needed for camping with young children. The campground was busier than she had expected for early November, with nearly half of the sites occupied by families with children of various ages. The other campers seemed friendly and responsible, with well-maintained equipment and obvious experience camping with kids. Aviana was relieved to see other single parents managing camping trips successfully, and she felt optimistic about their ability to handle 3 days in the mountains without incident. Their campsite was ideally located, with easy access to the restroom facilities and playground, while still offering enough privacy and natural beauty to feel like a genuine wilderness experience. The site included a picnic table, fire ring, and level ground for their tent, with mature trees providing shade and a sense of enclosure that made it feel cozy and secure. Emma and Tyler were immediately excited by the adventure of sleeping outdoors and began exploring the area around their campsite with the enthusiasm that made family camping such a rewarding experience. The first day proceeded perfectly according to Aviana's plans. They set up their tent together, with the children helping to stake down the rainfly and organize their sleeping bags and personal items. They cooked dinner over the campfire, roasted marshmallows for s'mores, and spent the evening playing card games by the light of their battery-powered lantern. Both children adapted quickly to the camping routine and seemed genuinely excited about spending the night in the tent. The first night passed without incident, with all 3 of them sleeping soundly in their warm sleeping bags, while the sounds of the forest provided a peaceful backdrop. When they woke up on Saturday morning, Emma and Tyler were eager to explore more of the campground and participate in the nature programs that were offered by the park rangers. Aviana felt proud of how well the trip was going and confident that she had made the right decision to attempt camping with her children despite her inexperience with outdoor recreation. Saturday's activities included a guided nature walk, a demonstration of wildlife tracking techniques, and a campfire program where park rangers shared stories about the history and ecology of the Pisgah National Forest. Emma and Tyler participated enthusiastically in all the programs, asking questions and interacting with other children who were camping with their families. The other parents were friendly and helpful, sharing camping tips and offering assistance with equipment or supervision when needed. As evening approached on their second night, Aviana began to notice subtle changes in the atmosphere of the campground that made her increasingly uncomfortable. The normal sounds of family conversation, children playing, and camp activities gradually diminished as darkness fell, but they were not replaced by the peaceful quiet she had expected. Instead, she began hearing sounds that seemed out of place in an established campground. Irregular movement through the forest surrounding the camping area, occasional vocalizations that did not sound like normal human conversation, and the feeling that they were being observed by unseen watchers. The first clear indication that something was wrong came when Tyler woke up around midnight, frightened by sounds outside their tent that he described as people walking around our camp. When Aviana listened carefully, she could hear what did sound like footsteps circling their campsite, but the pattern was wrong somehow. The sounds were too quiet and too coordinated to be other campers moving around normally, and they seemed deliberately designed to avoid the established paths and common areas of the campground. As she continued listening, Aviana realized that the sounds were not limited to their immediate area, but were coming from throughout the campground. Multiple individuals were moving through the camping area with obvious stealth and coordination, avoiding the areas where campfires were still burning or where campers might be awake, but systematically investigating the sites where families were sleeping in their tents. The systematic nature of the movement suggested that this was not random activity by local residents or other campers, but organized surveillance by people who knew the layout of the campground and were deliberately gathering information about the families who were camping there. The coordination and stealth required for such an operation indicated extensive experience and sophisticated planning. When the sounds continued for over an hour without any indication that they were moving away from the camping area, Aviana decided to wake Emma and Tyler and prepare them for the possibility that they might need to leave their tent quickly. She explained the situation in terms that would not panic them, while ensuring that they understood the importance of following her instructions immediately and without question. The escalation came around 2 a.m. when the passive surveillance evolved into active harassment. Someone began throwing small rocks at their tent, creating sharp impacts that were clearly intentional and designed to wake them up and create fear. The thrown objects were not large enough to damage the tent or cause injury, but they were persistent and came from multiple directions, indicating that several individuals were participating in the assault. Emma and Tyler were terrified by the attacks on their tent, and Aviana realized that she needed to get them to safety immediately, rather than hoping that the harassment would stop on its own. She helped them put on their shoes and jackets as quietly as possible, then led them out of the tent toward the campground's main facilities, where there were lights and possible help from other campers or campground staff. As they moved through the campground, they discovered that other families were experiencing similar harassment. Several tents showed signs of having been pelted with rocks or other thrown objects, and they could hear frightened conversations and crying children from multiple campsites. The attacks were not targeting their families specifically, but were part of a coordinated assault on the entire campground designed to create fear and confusion. The most disturbing discovery was that the individuals conducting the attacks seemed to be specifically targeting families with young children. The harassment was more intense and persistent at campsites where children were present, while sites occupied by adult-only groups or experienced outdoor enthusiasts were largely left alone. This suggested that the attackers were not random vandals or thrill seekers, but predators with specific objectives related to families and children. When Aviana and her children reached the campground's central facilities, they found several other families who had fled their campsites due to similar harassment. The group included parents with children ranging in age from toddlers to teenagers, all of whom reported coordinated attacks on their tents and the feeling that they were being systematically watched and evaluated by unseen observers. The attacks continued, even after the families had gathered in the lighted area around the main facilities. Thrown objects continued to impact the building and surrounding area, and the sounds of movement in the forest indicated that their attackers were maintaining surveillance and pressure despite the presence of multiple witnesses and the possibility of intervention by law enforcement. Most terrifying was the realization that their attackers were not deterred by the presence of multiple adults or the possibility of resistance. The persistence and coordination of the assault suggested people who were confident in their ability to control the situation and who had extensive experience conducting similar operations against families in wilderness settings. When one of the fathers attempted to use his cell phone to call for help, the group discovered that all of their devices were showing no signal, despite being in an area where coverage was normally reliable. The systematic disruption of communication suggested that their attackers had the technical capability and planning sophistication to isolate their targets and prevent them from summoning assistance. The siege of the central facilities continued until dawn, with the attackers maintaining pressure through thrown objects, coordinated noise, and the constant presence of observers in the surrounding forest. The psychological impact of the sustained assault was devastating, particularly for the children who had never experienced anything like organized human predation in what they had assumed was a safe, controlled environment. As daylight began to filter through the forest, the attackers gradually withdrew, leaving behind evidence of their presence, but no clear indication of their identity or objectives. The families who had survived the night together were traumatized and exhausted, but they had avoided physical harm through their decision to band together and seek safety in numbers. The aftermath of the incident revealed the systematic nature of the attack and the sophistication of the people who had conducted it. The campground showed evidence of extensive surveillance and planning, with signs that the attackers had been observing and preparing for their assault for days or possibly weeks before actually carrying it out. Law enforcement officials who investigated the incident were unable to identify the attackers or determine their motives, but they acknowledged that the coordination and persistence of the assault indicated organized criminal activity rather than random vandalism or teenage pranks. The systematic targeting of families with children and the technical sophistication required to disrupt communications suggested predators with extensive experience and specific objectives. Aviana and her children never attempted camping again, and the incident fundamentally changed their relationship with outdoor recreation and their confidence in the safety of wilderness areas. The experience had shown them that even established, well-maintained campgrounds could be infiltrated by predators who viewed families as targets rather than fellow outdoor enthusiasts sharing the natural environment. Oakland had been volunteering with the Blue Ridge Mountain Search and Rescue Team for over 7 years, responding to calls for missing hikers, injured climbers, and lost hunters throughout the Virginia wilderness areas. As a certified emergency medical technician with advanced wilderness rescue training, she was often called upon for the most challenging operations that required both medical skills and extensive experience navigating difficult terrain in adverse conditions. Her background made her particularly valuable for operations involving lost or injured individuals in remote areas where traditional emergency services could not reach. She had participated in dozens of successful rescues, from simple day hikers who had taken wrong turns to complex technical rescues involving rock climbing accidents and multi-day searches for missing persons in vast wilderness areas. The call that would fundamentally change her understanding of wilderness safety came on a cold December morning when the team was notified about a missing hiker in the George Washington National Forest. The subject was a 34-year-old software engineer from Richmond named Marcus Webb, who had failed to return from a solo day hike on the Appalachian Trail section near Shenandoah National Park. Webb had registered his hiking plan with park rangers, indicating that he intended to complete a 12-mile section of trail and return to his vehicle by sunset. When he failed to appear at his scheduled return time and did not respond to cell phone calls, his girlfriend contacted authorities and requested a search operation. The weather conditions were challenging, with temperatures dropping into the 20s and light snow that would make tracking difficult. The initial search began at dawn the following day, with teams deployed to cover Webb's planned route and several alternative paths he might have taken if he became lost or disoriented. Oakland was assigned to a 2-person team with another experienced searcher, and they were responsible for covering a section of trail that included several difficult stream crossings and areas where navigation could be challenging even for experienced hikers. The search proceeded systematically for the first several hours, with teams maintaining radio contact and reporting their progress at regular intervals. The trail conditions were difficult but manageable, and the light snowfall had not yet accumulated enough to seriously impede movement or tracking efforts. All teams were optimistic about locating Webb quickly, assuming that he had simply become lost or had been delayed by the weather conditions. Oakland's team was the first to discover evidence of Webb's presence in the search area. About 6 miles from his intended starting point, they found clear boot prints in a muddy section of trail that matched the description of his footwear. The tracks showed that he had been moving at a normal pace and following the established trail with no indication of injury or distress. But as they continued following his trail, they began to notice other tracks that suggested Webb had not been hiking alone. The additional footprints were made by multiple individuals wearing what appeared to be primitive footwear, or possibly no shoes at all. The tracks showed that these other people had been following Webb for a considerable distance, maintaining parallel courses through the forest while staying off the established trail. The tracking became more complex and disturbing as Oakland and her partner continued following the evidence. Webb's tracks showed that he had become aware of his followers and had begun taking evasive action, leaving the main trail and attempting to lose them by traveling through difficult terrain where tracking would be more challenging. His pursuers had responded by coordinating their efforts, with different individuals approaching from multiple directions to prevent his escape. The pursuit had continued for several miles through increasingly remote and difficult terrain, with Webb's tracks showing signs of panic and desperation as he attempted to evade capture. His footprints became erratic and showed evidence of stumbling and falling, indicating that he was exhausted and possibly injured by his efforts to escape from his pursuers. The trail ended at a small clearing where the evidence showed that Webb had finally been overtaken by the people who had been following him. The area showed signs of a struggle, with disturbed vegetation and scuff marks indicating that he had attempted to resist capture. Most disturbing were the drag marks leading away from the clearing toward what appeared to be a well-concealed trail that was not marked on any official maps. Oakland immediately radioed the search coordinator to report their findings and request additional resources, but the response she received was unexpected and deeply troubling. Instead of dispatching additional search teams to follow the drag marks and investigate the hidden trail, she was ordered to return to base camp immediately and avoid any further investigation of the area where Webb had apparently been captured. The explanation provided by the search coordinator was that the area where they had discovered the evidence was outside the official search boundary, and the pursuing the investigation further would require coordination with federal authorities who were not available for immediate consultation. Oakland was told that other teams would handle the follow-up investigation and that her responsibility was limited to reporting what she had found. Despite her years of experience with search and rescue operations, Oakland had never encountered a situation where a clear trail leading to a missing person was not immediately pursued by all available resources. The decision to abandon the investigation when they had obvious evidence of Webb's location and the circumstances of his disappearance went against every protocol and instinct she had developed as a rescue volunteer. Against direct orders from the search coordinator, Oakland and her partner decided to continue following the drag marks and hidden trail to determine Webb's fate and gather additional evidence that could be used to mount a proper rescue operation. They understood that their decision could result in disciplinary action or removal from the search team, but their commitment to Webb's safety overrode their concerns about protocol violations. The hidden trail led through dense forest for nearly 2 miles before reaching what appeared to be a permanent settlement that was completely invisible from any official trail or accessible area. The settlement consisted of multiple structures built from natural materials and camouflaged so effectively that they would be undetectable to aerial searches or casual observation by hikers or hunters. The sophistication of the settlement was immediately obvious and deeply disturbing. The structures were not temporary shelters or primitive camping areas, but permanent buildings constructed with advanced knowledge of wilderness survival techniques and camouflage methods. The entire complex had been designed to support long-term habitation, while remaining completely hidden from outside detection. As Oakland and her partner observed the settlement from concealed positions, they saw clear evidence that multiple people were living there permanently, and that the community had been established for years rather than months. The residents had developed agriculture, animal husbandry, and craft production capabilities that indicated complete self-sufficiency and sophisticated social organization. Most horrifying was the discovery that Webb was not the first missing person who had been brought to the settlement. The community included individuals who matched the descriptions of hikers, hunters, and campers who had been reported missing in the region over several years. These people appeared to be living in the settlement voluntarily, but their behavior and appearance suggested that they had been fundamentally changed by their experiences and were no longer the same people who had originally disappeared from hiking trails. The residents of the settlement moved and interacted with the coordinated efficiency of people who had developed their own social structures and survival methods completely outside the boundaries of civilized society. Their clothing, tools, and behavior indicated years of primitive living, but their organization and capabilities suggested that they had not simply reverted to a savage state, but had created their own functional civilization. When Oakland and her partner were discovered observing the settlement, they realized that their presence had been detected long before they had become aware of the community's existence. The residents had been tracking and evaluating them from the moment they had entered the hidden trail, and their continued surveillance of the settlement had been allowed rather than prevented. The confrontation that followed was unlike anything in Oakland's experience with wilderness search and rescue operations. The residents of the settlement demonstrated that they had extensive knowledge of search and rescue protocols and had been systematically monitoring and interfering with rescue operations for years. Their ability to capture missing persons and integrate them into their community while avoiding detection by professional search teams indicated planning and capabilities that went far beyond simple wilderness survival. The settlement's residents made it clear that Webb and the other missing persons were now permanent members of their community and would not be returned to the outside world. They offered Oakland and her partner the same choice that had apparently been given to previous missing persons: join the community voluntarily or be integrated by force. The escape that followed demonstrated the settlement's confidence in their ability to control the situation and their willingness to allow selected individuals to return to the outside world as long as they understood the consequences of reporting what they had discovered. Oakland and her partner were allowed to leave, but with the clear understanding that any attempt to lead authorities back to the settlement would result in retaliation against them and their families. The official search for Marcus Webb was concluded after 5 days with no trace found, and he was presumed to have died from exposure or injury in the wilderness. Oakland's report of discovering the hidden settlement and evidence of his capture was dismissed as stress-related hallucinations, and she was quietly removed from the search and rescue team for psychological evaluation. She never returned to wilderness search and rescue work, and she never attempted to locate the hidden settlement or contact authorities about what she had discovered. The experience had shown her that the wilderness areas she thought she understood could harbor communities that existed completely outside the knowledge or control of law enforcement and rescue services, and that missing persons cases might have explanations that were far more disturbing than simple accidents or natural disasters.